Good evening to our comrades in Asia, good afternoon to comrades in Europe and in Africa, and good morning to all the comrades in the Americas. We have a few others still joining, but perhaps we start slowly. Thanks very much for joining us today again. Really great to see you. And we are really happy to have with us today Josiah Rector, who is assistant professor at the University of Houston in the US, and who developed for us a very interesting video lecture on the relationship of labor to the environmental movement in the US. So Josiah, perhaps we start immediately with a question that tries to bring up perhaps one of some of the key insights from your video lecture, and it is about the point you're making that this overall context, in the 70s, 80s became more difficult, especially with the job relocation, corporate union busting, and conservative political attacks on unions. The alliance between labor and environmental movements was also subjected to more fissures and tensions, with the overall effect of undermining their collaboration. Now, as a historian of their relationship over time, what are, in your opinion, possibilities for such an alliance in the near future, where we expect the overall context in the US to be even more challenging for labor and other social movements, and more specifically, in this case, the environmental movement? What does the history teach us?
Thanks, Edlira. I appreciate that. And thanks to everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to a dialogue with you. To answer your question, one thing that history teaches us is that there always is at least some grounds for collaboration between the labor and environmental movements. There are certain inextricable connections between the concerns of environmentalists and the concerns of trade unionists, and more broadly between working people and people who are concerned about public health, conservation. Even at moments of relatively weak collaboration, for example, in the 1980s in the US, you still had some collaboration around issues of occupational health, for example. Anyone who's concerned about pollution also has to be concerned about occupational health. That's a very basic way in which trade unions and environmentalists have common interests. But in terms of having a robust political alliance, it does depend on policy, and it depends on things like coalition formation. Right now in the United States, as in many countries around the world, we see a resurgence of right-wing politics and authoritarianism. We see the traditional center-left losing support from working class people. This problem, so-called working class de-alignment, it has been talked about in many countries. And this is very different in countries that traditionally have social democratic and labor parties, or socialist and communist parties. In the US, you have, just the Democrats and Republicans, but this trend of working class de-alignment away from the Democratic Party and voting for right-wing parties that are opposed to labor unions and environmental action has certain parallels in Western Europe and Brazil and other parts of the world, the Philippines in various ways. Right now, the Biden administration in 2022 signed into law, or President Biden signed into law, the Inflation Reduction Act, which approved over $300 billion in spending, including tens of billions of dollars in tax credits for the production of, for example, battery facilities, carbon capture and storage, and other kinds of projects that were intended to reduce carbon emissions in the US economy. And these projects are scattered across the United States, and some of them are in so-called red states that are dominated by the Republican Party. Some of them are in so-called blue states dominated by the Democratic Party. And actually, because of the geographical distribution of these tax credits, and because it takes years to build these facilities, there are some Republicans in the US Congress who would oppose repealing this legislation. So there is going to be large-scale investment in things like production of electrical vehicles, in carbon capture and storage projects, solar and wind energy, and so on. And it will vary across the US. And there are a variety of different constituencies for these projects. Now, corporations that invest in production of electric vehicles or that invest in solar energy are not necessarily more friendly toward labor unions than traditional dirty industries. And a lot of the US renewable energy industry is bitterly anti-union. A lot of jobs in the solar industry pay $15 an hour or less. And one of the challenges of getting labor unions on board with the transition to renewable energy has been that the tradition of class struggle in industries such as coal mining did produce relatively high-paying jobs for a sector of the working class. And a lot of these electric vehicle plants are non-union. A lot of these solar energy projects are non-union. And also, there's a problem of long-term employment prospects. A coal-fired power plant or a nuclear energy plant provides relatively long-term stable employment. A lot of solar projects produce relatively intermittent job opportunities, and they're mostly non-union. We see this here in the state of Texas, where the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO, has something called the Texas Climate Jobs Project, and they're pushing to unionize renewable energy. But there's a lot of skepticism among workers because a lot of these projects are lower wage or non-union. But the bottom line is for there to be a convergence of interest between the labor and environmental movements, there needs to be public investment in renewable energy. And ultimately, there needs to be an expansion of things like public transportation. We can have a debate about how to decarbonize the power grid, but there needs to be obviously a huge expansion of wind and solar, and in certain regions, hydroelectric and geothermal. I know that there's a lot of controversy about the issue of nuclear and so on, but there needs to be large-scale public investment that is likely to involve things like tax credits and subsidies. There need to be labor standards, and these industries need to be unionized to make sure that these jobs are relatively secure and high paying. Also, there needs to be just transition policies for workers in the dirty industries. And that means that nobody should lose their pension or lose access to high wage employment because a coal-fired power plant or a coal mine closed. And there are years of proposals in the labor movement, as I talk about in my presentation, about how to do this. And in some countries, like in Germany, some coal miners, for example, received early retirement because of militant struggle by trade unionists in Germany. And that's a larger discussion. But older workers could receive early retirement and guaranteed pensions. Younger workers could receive income replacement or job transfer rights. And more broadly, I would argue that we will not get working class buy-in for an energy transition unless we address the problem of working class economic insecurity. And this, of course, looks very different in countries in the global north and countries in the global south. Countries that have larger informal sectors, for example, versus countries that have larger formal sectors. But everywhere, both in the global north and the global south, the majority of the population deals with economic insecurity. In the United States, about a third of the population could not come up with $400 in an emergency. And half the population lives paycheck to paycheck and has a lot of consumer debt and so on. So unless this question of economic security is dealt with, then conservatives and opponents of environmental regulations will always be able to weaponize economic insecurity against action on things like climate change. They can pit jobs against the environment. And employers have an easier time driving down environmental standards, driving down wages if the working class is economically insecure. So I think that trade unions, labor parties, working class movements need to support policies that increase the economic security of the working class while also increasing investments in things like renewable energy. So this could mean a jobs guarantee. This could mean guaranteed income or a combination of both. But we need to address people's immediate bread and butter concerns if we are going to get buy-in for a climate transition. And this is where I'll close. You see Donald Trump did this in the United States, but you also see far-right parties in Europe. You see people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil do the same thing. but they play into fear, and they weaponize economic insecurity. So Donald Trump, for example, promised he would bring back coal mining jobs. And Donald Trump actually did particularly well in counties in the United States that saw closures of coal mines, closures of coal-fired power plants, and closures of factories in the last 10 years. Now, he was lying to his voters. Actually, during the Trump administration, closure of coal-fired power plants was actually faster than under President Obama. So he completely lied about this idea of bringing back coal mining jobs because, of course, presidents don't control these long-term cycles of capital investment. They can sign into law bills that will direct investment in one place or another, but these are long-term projects, right? But his promise to bring back the jobs helped him win the presidential election. And of course, the first thing he will do is roll back environmental regulations, pull out of, the Paris Climate Agreement again, and so forth and so on. So maybe that was an overly long or rambling answer, but I think that the possibility for collaboration really requires addressing this issue of economic insecurity on the part of the working class and connecting fears about income loss and layoffs and job losses with the energy transition, not just in a rhetorical way, but in a very specific and targeted way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for that. We open up for questions, comments. Who would like to go first? Ian, go ahead, please. And perhaps just introduce yourself very briefly.
Sure. Ian Horsford from Antigua and Barbuda. You somewhat answered my question because I was going to ask you in regards to the Green New Deal, how it could actually be reworked to get greater acceptance by society as well as the unions on board. Be that as it may, in terms of where do you see, for instance, labor standards in Third World or the South, Global South, fit into the equation in terms of addressing some of the insecurities in the, say, for instance, in the Global North, for instance, because we're living in a globalized world, much of capital is actually moving to where labor is cheap and where they also have limited environmental standards. I haven't heard much talk about the impact of producing batteries in the Global South, which is a major issue. And if that aspect is not dealt with, I don't know, it will ultimately impact what can be the options or strategies in the Global North for workers.
Thank you for that. Those are both good questions. So if I understood you correctly, the first part was about how could there be greater buy-in for the Green New Deal. And the second part was about labor standards in the Global South, including around like renewable energy industries. As to the first question, in the United States, of the two political parties, the Republican Party was, of course, overwhelmingly opposed to the Green New Deal, but also the leaders of the Democratic Party were largely opposed to it as well. There was a progressive wing of the Democratic Party represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or longtime independent Senator Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with the Democrats. But most of the Democratic Party was opposed, and that's because the Democratic Party is largely funded by corporate interests that oppose key features of the Green New Deal, like a jobs guarantee, increase in the minimum wage, and so forth. They much prefer a more market-driven approach consisting of things like tax credits to an expansion of public ownership, increased minimum wage, jobs guarantee. Those are overwhelmingly opposed by powerful sectors of capital in the United States. So I think to achieve anything like a Green New Deal would have to come from below. It would require action on the part of trade unions and possibly alternative political party experiments. But we're a long way from that in the US. Also, a lot of trade unions in the US are very skeptical of the Green New Deal because some of it is because it emerged from nonprofits and NGOs more than from the trade unions. And there were problems of communication between the nonprofits and the unions. Many of the unions are suspicious of the nonprofits. And there are conflicts over things like carbon capture and storage, nuclear energy. That would be a longer conversation. As to the second point, you're absolutely right. Obviously, governments in the Global South are incentivized to seek to attract global capital, and there's a kind of a race to the bottom. And because of the complete failure of the global north to pay its ecological debts, and because of this odious debt that developing countries are often paying, and because of the structure of the global economy, they're obviously incentivized to do anything they can to attract global investment, and typically don't have the resources to enforce strong environmental standards, enforce strong labor standards. And we see this very clearly in renewable energy, as we do in other sectors, the terrible conditions in, cobalt mining and lithium mining. This is obviously a huge source of conflict in places like Latin America. Thea Riofrancos has written about, for example, in Ecuador, conflicts between indigenous activists and center-left governments of the so-called pink tide around questions of oil extraction. This is a big issue in Bolivia with lithium. And clearly, this is going to be a struggle within countries in the global south, involving trade unions, involving indigenous rights organizations, involving political parties and NGOs and civil society. And in the context of the global north, I mean, there could be boycotts and pressure campaigns against multinational corporations. We can advocate trade union internationalism. But it's clear that the multinationals have the upper hand here. And quote unquote green capitalism behaves much the same way as traditional dirty capitalism. The incentive structures are towards exploiting workers, externalizing environmental costs onto the global south, onto poor communities, onto workers. And it's going to be a huge struggle. I don't have any easy answers, though. I would love to hear more from you and what your perspective is.
Thanks a lot for that. Ian, do you want to say something?
Well, from my standpoint, some of these issues have to look at, if you're looking at trade agreements, these things have to be enshrined. But at the end of the day, everyone is basically, most countries are looking for the cheapest labor, trying to get the best out of trade. So you have the same rush to the bottom. So I don't know the actual international framework for trade, the way which is currently structured, particularly even at WTO, it's not conducive to having higher standards, labor standards. That's just the reality. But I think, like, for instance, the Confederation of, for labor and stuff at the international, those are things that we really need to start to have to look at strategies to addressing these issues that are taking place at that level. I know sometimes, because you have so many different organizations, it's difficult to come to a consensus, because at the end of the day, various international labor organizations are only as strong as the various unions that actually make it up. But it's just obvious that you see what's going on, but there can't seem to be any consensus of a proper strategy going forward. And it's just getting worse. Even you start to move on to other things, whether it be, for instance, you start looking at the whole issue of technology in terms of use of labor, all these other issues. These things are taking place at an international level, but we're just battling on home ground.
Yeah, I mean, just to perhaps add to the point that one of the conversations we are having in relationship to another course, Just and Green Labor's Ecological Question, is about the space for having political discussions of changing the patterns of production and consumption. Because going back to the point you were making, Ian, if we continue with extractivism, which is still very important for the supposedly renewables, if we continue for the batteries and all the other infrastructure, but if we continue with that, first, there is not enough minerals anyways to start with. And second of all, we are still in the same patterns of exploitation of nature and of people. So in a way, the bigger question is, it's not just about moving to renewables, with the same level of consumption of energy that we actually have, but it's actually how do we change the, everything, what is being produced and what is being consumed. And that's a question that is not being taken up so much by labor. And I think that's where the big gap is. And that's the kind of the point that we are trying to push with the Just and Green course. But going back to your question about the international trade unions and what can they do, I think this is a small contribution into pushing in the direction of actually what can be done. But as you're totally right, it's not just about how weak or strong trade unions are, but especially how weak or strong politically the big trade unions are, because they kind of set the tone of what happens in the international labor movement. But fair conversation. Perhaps we continue with this one on the relationship of labor to environmental movements. Is there any other question from comrades? Because if not, you make a point in the beginning of your video lecture, Josiah, about this different class positions of the environmental movements and the labor movements. And the argument again in our other course has been that the environmental movements have been often class blind when it comes to their demands. So if you can elaborate a bit more, how has that played in the US context?
Absolutely. And, it's actually funny. In Texas, there was recently a group of workers at an environmental organization who tried to unionize. And they were actually, the union was busted, but so these staffers at an environmental organization tried to form a union and they were almost fired. But, it goes both ways, right? Like, just like there are environmental contradictions with industrial capitalism that can extend to support for dirty energy projects by traditional unions. Conversely, there are major class contradictions, obviously, with environmental organizations. And they vary, right? Many scholars who write about the environmentalism of the poor in the global South or global North or the environmental justice movement might write about people who have very few resources that are fighting against a toxic waste dump or polluting industry, or it could be like dams in India, indigenous people struggling against extractive projects. And these are obviously not powerful, wealthy folks, and they're fighting kind of environmental fights with few resources. But if we're talking about the big green groups, right, we're in the US, if we're talking about the Sierra Club, Audubon Society, these are large hierarchical organizations with boards of directors, millions of dollars in grants, large budgets, and so forth. In the case of environmentalism specifically, a lot of there's a fundamental relationship, obviously, between environmental politics and science, right? And a lot of the evidence that we have about the degradation of the natural world, but also threats to human health, are given to us by scientists, whether it be earth system scientists, conservation biologists, or people who study health, like epidemiologists and physicians and so forth, right? People who understand environmental cancers or ocean acidification or the effects of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere, or the engineers who design renewable energy technologies and so on. And these are extremely important areas of expertise, but they are also obviously an elite sector of society, right? And, explaining climate change to a layperson or explaining the risk, the statistical increase in risk of cancer or Alzheimer's disease from air pollution, it can sometimes be a challenging thing. And I think the right wing exploits the sort of resentment of working class people about being talked down to by experts. And there's a kind of a politics of anti-intellectualism that feeds into climate science denialism. It's similar to the kind of anti-vaccine rhetoric. I mean, you see this with the Trump administration, where they're playing into the anti-vaccine and the anti-climate science discourse. And they say, we hate the experts, we're for the little person, even though they are funded by billionaires, right? But there's this kind of hypocritical and ridiculous rhetoric, but it's used effectively by the right, because yes, in a society where most people are struggling to get by, I think it comes back to the problem of the hierarchy of people's crises. Some people have talked about how in France, with the so-called Yellow Vest movement, when there were protests against the carbon tax under Macron, one of the slogans, I believe, was they're telling us to worry about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. And in the case of environmental threats, oftentimes we're talking about things that seem physically remote. And this is true, I think, with health concerns. So like if someone is being told that exposure to a toxic chemical might increase the risk of cancer in 20 years from now, but they are trying to feed their family this week, not everyone has the luxury to worry about a long-term occupational health risk. Although obviously occupational health risk can be immediate. Someone might die tomorrow in an unsafe workplace. So people understand the immediate threats of, say, occupational hazards. But if you're talking about like toxic chemicals, cancer risk, that's relatively abstract. Same thing with climate change. If someone loses their house in a flood or in a hurricane or in a wildfire, that's very direct. But for most people, the climate risk is relatively abstract. And so if you're being told by credentialed experts that there is a statistical increased risk of a health problem or climate risk in the future, but you're struggling right now, it's very easy for, I think, conservatives to exploit both the class resentment to the credentialed expert and the seeming abstractness of the risk, and to sort of indefinitely delay action. So how do you solve that problem? I think that trade unions need political education programs for their members. Just like around health and safety, there needs to be like environmental political education to counter messaging from the corporate media and disinformation from employers, disinformation from propaganda. I think that giving people access to education in general, it is a way of fighting against. We need to democratize knowledge, right? Like if environmental science or climate science is only understood by a rarefied elite, I think that plays into the hands of those who would oppose action. But we need to democratize access to this information. And you know, this is, I think, inseparable from the larger problem of, you know, empowering working class people and having institutions that are responsive to working class concerns. I don't know. Maybe I could come up with a better answer later in the day, but it's very early here. Sorry.
Yeah, of course, it's great. There are a few questions in the chat box. I think one has to do more with organizing strategies, but perhaps we could combine it with the questions that we received for the workshop beforehand, especially one that perhaps connects also with the question from Nyon Dame Jacques Hugo. Sorry, perhaps I didn't pronounce that well. And it relates really to the example that you mentioned in your video lecture about organizing for EV production to be in unionized workplaces. So is that argument playing out in organizing workers in renewables, the argument about the environment, or is it just seen as a bread and butter trade union kind of business? How's that?
And I can only answer this in a very anecdotal way. And I would also begin by agreeing with something you said earlier, Ed Lira. It's not just about a shift to renewables. We need to change the way we live. I completely agree with you. You know, we like this kind of lifestyle, which is really exemplified in the United States of, you know, relatively high per capita consumption, people driving everywhere, car dependency, suburban sprawl, and so forth. Is fundamentally unsustainable, and we need a huge expansion. Instead of private electric cars produced by oligarchs like Elon Musk, you know, or corporations like Stellantis, we need rail systems, right? We need like publicly owned rail. Instead of suburban sprawl, we need more social housing. We don't need, you know, in the US, the real estate developers want people to go into debt to buy McMansions instead of like efficient, smaller housing that is more efficient in its use of heating and so forth and so on. We could go on down the line, or the kind of food system that we have designed by agribusiness, et cetera. But On the question of how workers view it, I don't think that I actually think there's a lot of room for academic research and journalism on this question. I don't think this is very well studied. I can give you an anecdotal answer. So I went to an event at a trade union hall here in Houston, Texas, and it was sponsored by the Seafarers Union. And it was on the issue of offshore wind projects in the Gulf of Mexico. And there were some workers who worked in construction in the building trades. And they were talking about how they feel about working on like an offshore wind project versus working in a more traditional construction project. And some of them said, one guy that I talked to said, I like the idea of working on something that's good for the environment. But I think people would be much more enthusiastic about those jobs if they are available. I think a lot of workers are very cynical. They don't think that these jobs are going to be available anytime soon, or they're not going to pay very well. If the jobs pay decently and if they're available, people would be happy to take them. And if they know that what they're doing is quote unquote good for the environment, then that is going to be a positive in the eyes of almost everybody. There are some people who say, I don't care, I just want a paycheck. But I think we sometimes underestimate workers' desire to actually make a positive contribution, including to things like environmental sustainability. I think a lot of working class people want to feel that what they are doing is good for the world. But they usually don't get the opportunity to work in industries that are quote unquote environmentally beneficial, even in a relative sense. But I've heard people say, I would love to work in an industry like that if the jobs were available, if the investments were there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Gifford, would you want to go see your hand?
Yeah, hi, I'm Gifford. I live in San Francisco in the US, and where the Sierra Club was founded in 1892, and there's a lot of limitations to the whole nonprofit industrial complex. My perspective, and maybe this is more a comment that lends itself to a question, is just like both of you just said, is it's like almost a civilizational question. Here in the US, the consumption is so high, the waste is so great, the inefficiencies, just the profit incentive. We need to redesign cities. We need to redesign production. We need to kind of like question designed obsolescence, where we always have to have the new version of any product, and things don't last. So I think a lot of it has to do with education, because I think like maybe Josiah, what you're saying is if you could meet with workers and they begin the process of kind of defining the way they work. If they work like you live in, I guess, Houston. That's the heart of like the petrochemical complex.
Oh,
And if it could start there, that's where it has to start is, and I think what you hit on earlier is really important. If, you're exposed to toxic chemicals, if you're working in the petroleum industry, and, cancer clusters, what do they call it? Like the cancer belt or whatever it is along the coast on the Gulf. As once workers could see that they could probably live longer lives and make the world better, and there are technologies that could allow us to consume less with some sustainable and ecologically sound ways of producing and things like that. That's where it begins. And I'm just going to give one anecdote, and I hope some of our Nigerian comrades could comment on this. Last year, I visited Lagos, and I was able to have a meeting with the Nigeria Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers, NUPANG. And I hope one of you Nigerians know him, Comrade Olufemi. He talked about that union in Nigeria having educational programs on just transition. So if we begin to talk about the topic, people can grapple with it. But if it's just some abstract thing, it's like this impenetrable boundary is like jobs versus the environment. Of course, people are going to choose jobs. So I think the complexity is how do we make, from the workers up, like from the bottom up, how do we make these ideas accessible to people? Because there are so few examples, except like Tony Mazzocchi, like in your video lecture, the OCAW, beginning with this just transition idea is like, we're not going to deny you your job. We're going to make sure the transition, you get a full union wage as we transition. People don't believe that. It sounds like we're kind of tricking them, but I think it begins with education. And, perhaps somebody on this discussion today have examples from around the world. I think Colombia, as we learned in our just transition course with GLUE, is, the indigenous struggle against extractivism is a beginning, but I think there are no easy answers. This is, in organizing, probably the most difficult question is how could we transition to a better world and like not people just defend their jobs and protect toxic industry. So more a comment than a question.
Yeah, thanks for that. And perhaps also connecting to, I think we mentioned a bit earlier the question of Comrade Opalua, but in particular, what can trade unions that are already in a strong position do? Like Nupeng and Nupengasa are a solid formation. They have lots of power. And then the other Union of Electricity in Industry in Nigeria that the Comrade has put is also a strong trade union. And it's somehow connected to what Gifford is saying. What can in particular strong trade unions do that start from a strong base of membership and perhaps some legitimacy in the society? I don't know whether, Josiah, you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I want to give space for others to speak on this for sure, but just to respond to Gifford, I mean, he's absolutely right. Of course, like on the Gulf Coast, on both the Texas and the Louisiana side, there are decades of epidemiological studies showing clusters of brain tumors among workers in the refineries and the petrochemical plants. And there's a long history, obviously, of both occupational health and environmental health disasters disproportionately affecting people of color, but also working class whites. And everybody knows that the industries are toxic and dirty. And Tony Mazzocchi and others in the OCAW in the 70s, 80s, and 90s did try to forge relationships with environmental groups and environmental justice groups. And there's a history of this, like the Labor Neighbor Project in Louisiana. And they won some small concessions, like getting the corporations to pay higher taxes in certain parishes in Louisiana, and some very limited concessions like air monitoring stations and so on. But basically, multinational corporate capital has organized in such a way that it's become harder to shut down facilities through striking, and they've steadily busted the unions and replaced workers with subcontractors and brought in more insecure workers with less training. And in the case of Houston, and it's the absolute belly of the beast, as Gifford noted. But what they've done is they've moved a lot of the refinery jobs further and further out. So most of the oil and gas jobs in Houston are like cubicle jobs for tech workers now. And there's these vast capital investments in these extremely polluting facilities all up and down the coast. And the workforces have changed dramatically. The steel workers local in Beaumont just recently dealt with this lockout by Exxon. But the corporations, they're utterly ruthless. They've drastically weakened the unions. And the small number of union jobs that have held on, that's a very tough fight. So I wish that I had a stronger answer on that. I really do. Tony Mazzocchi had a vision of a sort of a GI Bill style just transition, but he also thought that the Democratic Party was unlikely to embrace it, and he believed in a Labor Party, but it was tough to get the AFL-CIO to sign off on that. And here we are in 2024 with a second Trump administration coming in, and I wish I had a better answer as well. I really do. So I would love to hear from others who have insights about just transition policies getting more backing from trade unions or political parties or governments elsewhere in the world. I have long-term strategic ideas about what the labor and environmental movements in the US can do, but I don't have any immediate solutions to the predicament that we're in.
Yeah, we don't want to have this in a depressive tone.
Oh, no.
Definitely. Yeah. So comrades are very much welcome to come up with, of course, we are not forcing inspiring stories, but examples where actually unions and labor has understood that one. We have a question, a point by Ian. I don't think it's a question as much as a rhetorical question, I suppose. What will happen if everyone adopted the US lifestyle in the world? Yeah, definitely. I think that's Ian, if you are interested and you haven't done yet, the course that we have, I don't see Ian here, but the course we have on Just and Green Labor's Ecological Question deals exactly with that point of the imperial mode of living. And the most important point there is that it's not that workers are choosing, as Josiah, you were making the point. It's not that they are choosing to stay in those jobs that destroy the environment. They are forced into patterns of production and consumption, including taking the car every day, because if you don't have public transport, you're forced to take the car. So they find themselves forced into that position of actually polluting the environment. And I think that brings the bigger question of class. So for as long as we continue having our policies at the national level, the labor would always align with policies that somehow would improve the situation in their own country. And if we are having a horizontal line of looking at the working class around the world, perhaps we can come up to a different policy position. But yeah, so who would like to perhaps comment or yeah. Yes, Ayode, go ahead, comrade.
Yeah, thank you so much. My issues with environmental related to typically here in Nigeria, we have refinery, we fly gas, and for example, particularly Ogoni area, Niger Delta of my country here, there's a lot of pollutions, and people even die because of clean waters and what have you. And all these things affect workers there because our refinery that they abandoned for many years started working yesterday. And for the report we heard, there's the issue of the fuel that's coming out of it is not much clearer. And this one will have impact on our environment. And if you look at the system, typically, the labor union, the labor movement have been capacitated to still really fight for certain things that will make our environment cleaner and greener for people to move. So we are in a situation of bad economics coupled with bad policies, coupled with people are not even getting jobs to do, and whatever the job that come to them, whether it's environment friendly or not, they don't have choice. Just like you have to do something to make a living, and you have to keep your family moving. So all these things combined together, we have a serious impact into our environment and the pollutions going forward. And as a union, most of this industry have a union that cover the place. But apart from the union does not have much capability in terms of orientation, even for the members to have a confidence on how to fight for their rights so that they can be able to stand their authority when they are going beyond what will impact the environment. And a lot of things coming around, even the bush burning to clear the ground and what have you. People do this because they don't know the impacts that the smoke will have in our space. So one, if I may come in first, it's very important to address education and awareness so that everybody will really understand that this will affect all of us, not even only workers. And it will make us to even lose more jobs because most of industry in Enugu or what have you have been washed away with erosion. If you come to Edo State, there's a lot of gully erosion that most of industry built on those assets have been wiped away, and the people will still lose their job. We need a lot of educations, and we need a lot of policies that will be driven by the unionist movement. But do even the unionists have the capacity or information to stamp this authority or to suggest to the appropriate authority to bring out all this prevention that will affect us in that way? So in a nutshell, to me, the major issue here is awareness, educations, and they have the right leaders at the right particular place. Because you cannot give what you don't have. Most of the people that even fight for policy doesn't even understand the kind of policy they are fighting for. So if you have people, there's a first time we I have a seminar or a workshop concerned to environmental pollution. Many people did not even know that even if you block a sewage or you build your house in a reserve area for passages of water flowing and what have you, impacted to the environment, cause problem to the environment. Many people did not know. They just say, no, I have to build my house. But do you build your house in the areas that will not impact? For example, Lekki here in Lagos, we have a lot of flooding because of people blatantly refuse to follow the planning of that particular environment. So, and it cause problem for other people, they do the right thing. So these are the areas we need to look into. And as a unionist, we need to get it right so that our society can be better for it. Thank you.
Josiah, would you want to comment on that? Well, that was
That was excellent. That was fantastic. You know, I had a friend, Michael Bennett, who used to be an organizer in the United Auto Workers Union, and he did some work in Nigeria actually with the AFL-CIO. But I mean, I think that I've heard some stories about like occupational health and safety training among energy workers in Nigeria, but you know, I think your comments are also pointing to the inextricability of the community in the workplace, like the flooding issues that you're describing.
There are quite a few comments on the chat box about what's happening on the different countries and what is possible to do. So not sure, they're just comments. But I don't know if there is any question from the comrades in the room, in the workshop. Or I have two questions, but I don't want to abuse my power. So perhaps the first one is really, it seems to me, Josiah, that starting perhaps with a question that was in the beginning, that as more difficult becomes this situation for workers, more economic uncertainty, then the fewer would be the opportunities for this coalition to kind of progress or advance more. The thing is that capital knows that one, and most likely will try to do everything to make workers' life even more precarious and more uncertain. So we may be actually quite doomed if those preconditions are not going to be there. So where do we see some hope or a way out? Because as you mentioned, many of the traditional social democratic parties have also abandoned,
Right.
class politics, if you like. Or
so I do think that although we can take this workplace by workplace, I do think this fundamentally is a political struggle as much as it is an economic one, because we can talk about similarities between how these issues manifest themselves in different countries around the world, in specific places, in specific points of production. But the only way I think we're going to get out of this is through political struggle. And this is going to involve struggles within countries in both the global north and the global south. And like, there will always be some grounds for collaboration, but to fundamentally solve these problems, you do need to build political power. In the case of the United States, I could talk for a long time about what I think needs to happen, but unless working class people are able to shape environmental policy, and unless working class people see a benefit from changes in environmental policy, then they will be susceptible either to reactionary right-wing politics, or they will simply pull out of the political process and become apathetic. And then we are doomed, but we have to prevent that from happening. So we need mass movements and we need mass participation. This can't just be the problem with like a technocratic managerial politics or politics of the middle class is it's too small. The middle class does not have the numbers to change society, right? Like the working class is the majority everywhere. In every country on the planet, the working class is the majority. And if the working class is not participating in environmental politics, and if they don't see a future for themselves in mitigating climate change, then there's no hope for transforming these systems of production and transforming the balance of political power. And I think that there's a real threat of fascism and reactionary politics in many parts of the world right now. And fascists thrive on division and they thrive on apathy and cynicism. So, you know, we're talking about building mass politics and contesting for political power, contesting elections, contesting for the state. And there needs to be some kind of synthesis between trade union activism, labor organizing, and struggling to take state power. But that is going to look different in parliamentary democracies versus other kinds of political systems and so on. But it's not going to be solved just work by workplace locally. I think we are talking about contesting state power ultimately. I mean, people are going to disagree. Some people may be anarchists or socialist or social democrat or have different ideologies, but I don't see how you take on climate change without affecting the policies of nation states.
Yeah, it's sounding a bit better. There's a what you can actually do. We have some more minutes, so is there any more questions or comments? Esther, yes, please.
Yeah, I typed some question in the chat, but I think you didn't take note of it. I was asking about can collaboration between climate and labor help in addressing environmental justice? That was what I was asking. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I understood the question, other than what is the relationship between health and environmental justice?
Can collaboration between climate and labor help in addressing environmental justice?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this could take different forms. Obviously, like it depends on what we mean. But environmental justice organizations are, I mean, we see this, I think, clearly in the case of renewable energy, right? Because if we frame energy transition as just a question of moving to renewables, the supply chains for renewables could create environmental justice impacts on communities affected by lithium mining, for example. But there doesn't necessarily need to be an opposition. There could be collaboration between people fighting the environmental impacts of extractive projects, people representing workers in renewable energy sectors. So like in the case of the United States, there's a struggle to unionize electric vehicle plants. And those plants have local environmental impacts on communities around them. And there is a history of collaboration. I talked about the Labor Neighbor Project in Louisiana. That was a case where the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which had a history of fighting for the health and safety of chemical workers and oil workers, did collaborate with predominantly African-American communities living near the petrochemical facilities in Louisiana. And they actually did win some gains for the community. It didn't go far enough, but they were able to prevent things like toxic waste injection in the surrounding waterways near certain plants and so forth. So there is a history of successful collaboration in certain communities, and I could cite other examples as well.
Hello, yes, please.
Yes, I was going to mention something about this, but as I came a little bit later, I didn't know if you had talked about it. But I mean, there's something with this discussion of environmental issues that sometimes leads us to believe that some technology will change it all, as if it was like the electric car. So we will electrify all the transportation and we will be free of carbon emissions. And I think that maybe if you can mention something about, you already did just before I spoke, but something about this being sometimes a problem for other communities, and that there's not a technological solution, but that's the importance, I think, of unionizing every workplace, even for the production of these technologies, and that the technologies in itself are not the solution to the problem. It's a social problem. So maybe it's like a comment, but also a question. I know the electric car production was somehow like reverted in the US. I just watched a documentary about it, that there were several interests in the middle of course, oil companies, but also some other political issues. And well, if you can, I know it's a little bit late for this question because it's too long, but maybe you can comment something on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think electric vehicles are a good example of the inextricability of technology from social relations. One of the reasons that I would advocate in favor of rail and public transportation as opposed to just the production of private electric vehicles is, first of all, we have to challenge the control of these technologies by capital. And someone like Elon Musk, you know, the world's richest man, exemplifies, you know, these are the sorts of people who currently control electric vehicle production. And, you know, they have a vision of upward redistribution of wealth and domination of politics by a small elite. And frankly, also far-right politics. And that actually shows that there's nothing necessarily progressive about electric vehicles, you know, controlled by people like this. Public transport, I mean, we want to expand public ownership, and we also want to encourage different ways of living. Also, things like public transportation create durable long-term infrastructure. One of the problems with private capital investment is it's fickle and often temporary. And maybe you could unionize a factory, but they will close the factory. But if you have a public transportation system, that's potentially a much more durable investment, right? And it's subject to much more democratic pressure. I'm not saying that it's flawless, but it could potentially produce, you know, much more positive long-term impacts than unionizing one factory or something, putting aside the supply chain issues.
We are almost reaching the end, but Ayoade, please make a question, and then we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. My question goes to this technology of autonomy vehicles and electronic vehicles. You know, this thing work together with the battery and some modulars that's put together into the electronics before it's coming. What do you think will be the effect of this battery in the future? Because you have a lot of battery, you have a lot of modeling, you have a lot of all those compounds, you know, when one is spoiled, you remove it and put another one and what have you. What are the impacts? This material will cost us in futures, if you have an idea. Thank you.
I think it will be a huge problem. I mean, we know, you know, we know that in addition to the other components, that there are a lot of heavy metal contamination associated with batteries. We know there's a history of countries in the global north exporting toxic waste to the global south, whether it be Uruguay or Senegal or India. So, you know, in many cases, this kind of e-waste or electronic waste has been shipped to the global south from the global north. This is a long-standing pattern. And the workers themselves, for example, I was just reading about an Ultium battery plant in the US, I think in Ohio, and the workers are subject to very dangerous conditions in some of these battery facilities. The wages are not very high. Most of them are not unionized. And there are hazards of explosions and fires and burns and chemical fumes and so forth. But I think it just, it goes to back to this question of, you know, technology not being the silver bullet. There's a labor organizing question in all these industries, you know, which is the same as the questions in the so-called dirty industries of the past.
Yeah, it seems that also with what you said earlier, Josiah, that the environmental crisis represents really also a unique opportunity for labor to re-articulate its class project, and not just in terms of organizing workers, but even broader, the relationship with other components of the left, and the importance of organizing as an independent social force, something
Yes.
that I think has been reiterated in the different conversations we had. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank Josiah very much for the time, really, really appreciate it, and for the excellent video lecture. And thanks to everyone for your questions and comments. I just put in the chat the link to our course, Just and Green, Labor Psychological Question, that deals with many of these questions that were raised here. But today we had a chance to really analyze the relationship with the environmental movements, and perhaps lots of insights into what do we do in our own countries. So thanks very much again. Have a great rest of the week. And we are meeting for the last workshop next week. So stay tuned for that. Many, many thanks.